Today, the banks are the aggressors on the war on cash. Hello again, it's Martin North from Digital Finance Analytics, one that is posts covering finance and prop news with a distinctively Australian flavour. And today I'm joined by Robbie Barwick from the Citizens Party. Hi, Robbie.
Hi, Martin.
And also Dale Webster from the Regional. Hello, Dale.
Hello, how are you going, Martin?
Yeah, very good. Thanks very much for coming on, and welcome, Dale, to DFA. Robbie's been on a few times. We've spoken a lot, but you've actually not been on the channel before, so it's great to have you here. And this is a really, really important conversation.
Oh, 100%. Go ahead, Dale.
Oh, I was going to agree. I've been banging on about this for a couple of years now, so yes, very important.
Well, Martin, you and I did a very big show on the war on cash 3 years ago from memory. It's quite huge views. We stopped the federal government from introducing their bill to ban cash. But what's happened since has just been stunning at the speed at which the banks have been trying to push people away from cash use in the economy. But it doesn't work. There's no real evidence that the people want to go down that path. I mean, some people do, but they're leaving too many people behind. And when I first read Dale Webster's work on regional bank closures, what jumped out at me remember that very first big article you wrote, Dale, was the big impact in the bush is how much cash people are forced to use and use unsafely, actually, which is a real problem.
Yeah, so the basic premise of my main story, Big Four banks casting a dangerous shadow, I wanted to look at, I was trying to find a national angle. I'd been reporting on bank closures for a long time, and you just do it piecemeal. But I wanted to look at the national impact of losing so many bank branches across such a large geographical area, and the possible link between the growth of the shadow economy and, going really deep diving into researching what the banks were saying about, there being a cashless society and people using cash and all of that sort of thing. Everything pointed to the fact that it's just a narrative that they're propelling. And the most, you just cannot argue with the fact that there is more cash in Australia now than ever before in our history, even adjusted for inflation. Like it's out there and it's growing. Like during the pandemic, they were printing more cash. So having grown up in a country town and living in one now, I know the cash is still being used. So,
but what happens to the small businesses who are taking in this cash if they don't have banks to put it into?
Well, that's where the pressure's being put on the Australia Post network. It's really quite scary. I've just flagged my background as a bank manager's daughter. I lived behind a bank for years, and I'm very, very conscious of the security issues and the infrastructure that a proper bank has around it. And all of a sudden, a bank gives a town maybe a couple of months' notice at the most, if they're lucky, and tells the post office, you're getting all our banking. And if that's the last bank in the town, that's all people have got to rely on. And, I've been out to these towns, I've talked to so many people, and, the scramble to try and manage cash in a town that doesn't have a bank is just amazing. It's I never thought I'd see a day where it's happening, and it's happening to larger centres as well. They're not just the whistle-stop towns. They're really, my story goes into this. I talk about Casterton, really thriving little community that is on it's a service town, and it's lost 4 banks. And even there was an agency, there was a Bendigo Bank agency there as well, and even they've nicked off now. So it's, people are fending for themselves.
And let me just highlight this, Dale, because I think it's important people understand just how significant those closures are. I mean, we're not talking the odd branch here or there, are they? There is a systemic process of closing more and more branches and ripping out ATMs. And your reporting has been amazing in terms of just highlighting the extent of it. And as you say, it's not just small regional, places a long way from anywhere. Even places closer into the major centres are also going the same way now. And it's all being driven by, well, I think probably just cost, but also trying to squeeze cash out of the system. But as you say, at a time when in fact there's more cash in the system. So how does that work?
People find a workaround. Country people are very, very inventive and ingenious at that sort of thing. So they just get on with life, and they, the Reserve Bank did a report on looking at where Australia's missing cash is, and they found, they couldn't put their finger on where it was, but they found that it moves in and out of hoarding. So that reflects kind of what I've seen. People will sit on it for a little while, and they'll use it for a big payment sometimes, or it will just circulate around a town. Someone will pay cash for something, and that person will then pay cash for something else in their business, and that seems to be the way it's working at the moment. But I can take you through those figures if you did want to know a bit more about.
I think it will be really good just to give people, a bit of a view as to how serious these closures have been, because many people still haven't understood the significance of it.
Yeah. But can I interject before you do, Dale? Because we should put it up front in this discussion. You have a petition on the Parliament House website right now, which has 10 days left to run. And that petition, we need everybody to sign. So we'll put a link below this discussion. Immediately go there and sign that petition. And because it's a formal parliamentary petition, you've got to type in your details. They'll send you an email. You have to verify your signature. But we want as many signatures on that in the next 10 days, because that sends a message to the Treasurer, Jim Chalmers, which he has to respond to. And a fair amount of what you're about to go through, you've included a reason for the petition with a lot of this detail in there. So go through that now, but with that in mind, please, people, while you listen to this, go and sign that petition. It's very important you do that.
Yeah. The petition's asking for an immediate moratorium on bank closures and a new parliamentary inquiry. People wonder why I'm not supportive of the regional banking task force that was set up. I've been questioning the Treasurer in the last couple of months on this issue, and you would have thought an opposition little task force that's only got banking representatives and coalition members on it would have basically been relegated to the archives. But it's been very clear to me that Jim Chalmers is still expecting this task force to carry the weight of the regional bank closure issues. So I'm also asking for anything to come out of that inquiry to be pulped, because the last time the banks were allowed to come up with alternative service models, and just to be clear, the banking task force was only tasked with looking at alternatives to bank branch models. So it's never going to be an answer to stopping regional bank closures. But the last time that the government listened to the banks on this, 200 branches closed overnight in country Victoria, and they were replaced by Westpac brought in in-store agencies, and ANZ brought in local links, and within a matter of years they were gone as well. So it was just a mass exodus of branches. So if you're wondering why there's comments on there about the regional banking task force, that's it. Yep. But getting back to the figures, so I have the only complete list of regional banks in Australia from 1975 to present day. It took me a year to put together this database, and the reason I did it is that the government database, which is managed by APRA, has just been useless for media in particular. Media, whenever asking a bank about their branch footprints, gets directed to the APRA authorised deposit taking points of presence database. And you can't get answers. You can't get details on their networks, their towns, anything like that. So,
but isn't APRA required by law to maintain this list?
Yes, they have to maintain the list, and there's legislation around it, how the sites are classified. But it's set up in a way that you cannot see where the banks are open, and it doesn't track closures where they're closed either. So it might have been a bit anal, but I spent, virtually a year pulling this together, and it's a complete list. It used bank records to get a starting point, and I've used bank records and BSB to verify the rest of it. It also includes the minor banks as well. I don't have a starting point, so I can't say exactly what their networks are, but I can certainly say what's open and what they've closed in recent years. But the petition has some figures around it. The petition I applied for that before the federal election. So what you see on the petition is probably earlier this year, probably about March or April. The figures have grown significantly since then. So since 1975, the big four banks have closed 64% of their regional network. That's left us with just over 1,000 banks, big four banks across regional Australia. I think it's 1,018. I am quite sure that by the end of the year we'll dip below 1,000 banks, which is incredible. And the worst thing is they're not in 1,000 locations. They're all clustered into major centres. So it's off the top of my head that I just can't think of the number of towns that are left. But
140. There's 146.
Yeah. So there was 1,126 towns and cities and the Gold Coast and the Sunshine Coast that had banks in 1975. There are only 372 locations around Australia that now have banks.
Oh, yeah. Sorry. Yeah. So the 146 that I mentioned, they're the ones that are towns on the brink of complete loss of banking services with just one bank left.
Yeah. Well, it's even worse than that. There's that list changes because of bank closures. So, I've seen towns since then lose their banks, so they drop off the list. And I've seen towns that have had two banks lose one of their banks, so they've been added to the list. So that's a fluid number. But out of that number, there's 84 currently that are down to their last bank and they don't have a backup. So they don't have any form of minor bank, mutual bank or a franchise. So they're one decision away from no banking services.
And can I say, interject here, when I was working on the Australia Post inquiry and talking to Christine Holgate, she described to me in quite vivid detail just her research of what happens to a town when it loses its last bank. It withers and dies on the vine. The business, because everyone has to go to the next biggest centre to do their banking, they usually take their shopping with them. All the little shops clustered around your local bank, like your coffee shop and your bakery, etc., where people come in to do their banking, and they'll do this little, random shopping. That all suffers badly, and a town, the closure of its last bank can be the death knell for a town.
It can be the death knell, and there's certainly, hundreds of examples of that. But my work also shows that if it's a service centre, like Casterton was a service centre, it's a long way. It's a very long drive to the next biggest town. They just have to get on with it. And there's places up in New South Wales. Is it Golgong? I'd have to check, but they're in the same situation. They're tourist towns. They're still thriving, but they're trying to manage cash, and they're trying to navigate. You know, if they have to phone their bank, they're trying to navigate really difficult phone systems.
No, so severely inconveniencing the business community in these regional centres, and it's like the banks don't care.
Can I ask a question at this point, which is, when we talk about a branch, what's the definition of a branch, and what happens when a bank, for example, says, well, I'm not going to be there now 5 days a week, I'm going to be there half a day a week? Is that counted as a branch that's open or not?
This is a really, really good point, Martin. I think the FSU has concerns about this as well, and it is still classified as a bank branch. So according to legislation and the APRA data, they can still report as being a bank branch. My suggestion is that if we can get an inquiry up, that the terms of reference look at this. I think the APRA definition of a branch should require a minimum of service, face-to-face service hours to be able to be classified as a branch. It's a relatively simple process to have that amended. The legislation around this, the reporting standard has been changed before, and it's well within the Treasurer's power to add in a minimum opening hours caveat.
Yeah, great. And I think that's really important because, again, I've seen it from some of my surveys and things where, in fact, the number of available hours has dropped through the floor, but they'd still scrape under the under the bar, right, from an APRA point of view, which means that they're still reported as having a branch. So the effective reach of banking services across Australia has shrunk and shrunk and shrunk. Now, of course, there's a reason for that, because it's a cost. And in the current environment, banks are looking for many, many ways to reduce costs. And they would argue that handling cash is expensive and running physical real estate is expensive. But turn it back around, surely banking should be there to serve us and the community, not just to maximise the profits of the banks.
It's crazy that, a bank is set up to handle cash. That's their role in society, is to manage our currency, and they don't want to handle it. And they're being allowed to pull out of it. Just going back to what you were saying, Martin, about the classifications, part of my work revealed that there were errors in the APRA database classifications, and we've had a win in Parliament. Senator Malcolm Roberts raised this in Senate estimates, and there's a commitment from APRA, and I've also had it since from the Treasurer in correspondence, that any branch that doesn't meet the reporting standard criteria has no place in the branch list. So that means any branches that don't offer face-to-face banking services can no longer be, well, they've been doing it for some time, but the government has given an undertaking that they will clamp down on branches that aren't reporting their banks that aren't reporting their branches properly. So that ties in with some historic errors that I found through the Bendigo and Adelaide Bank network. They're long offenders. Rabobank also has been reporting incorrectly that they have face-to-face branches. But what it's also opened the floodgates for is the cashless branches that the banks are currently rolling out at such a scary rate that it takes your breath away. So NAB is rolling out cashless branches. That was raised by Senator Roberts in Parliament. I've since been told that ANZ is will be pulling tellers out of ANZ banks and replacing them with smart ATMs. That's very fresh information. So the government has given an undertaking that they will not allow the banks to list those sites as full service bank branches, and we just have to make sure that they hold to that.
Because the first the first line in the definition of a bank is takes cash and gives change. Yet these cashless branches, they're telling people it just seems such a bureaucratically ridiculous thing at the face-to-face interface between the public and the bank. They line up to do their banking, and then they're told by the poor teller, "Oh, you got cash, you got to go outside and stick it in that machine." And the poor customer's thinking, "Well, why can't you just take it?" Right? And this is what the bank honchos are forcing their staff to do. The end result of which will be the staff losing their job.
Yeah, exactly. It's a very spot on, Robbie. The critical thing that a town needs a bank for is their business floats. So, and to bank their takings. Even with a smart ATM, you can't get a business float. Some of them sort of have a little bit of a minor breakdown, but generally you can just get $50s and $20 notes and hundreds out of a smart ATM. People in small businesses, cafes, that sort of thing, they need $1 and $2 coins. They need $5.
Yep.
But you just can't get that with a smart ATM. And even if they do develop them to a point where you can, it still won't meet the criteria of a bank branch.
Yeah. No, and that's what we have to hold the government to account on, right? There's a reason that's the definition of a bank branch. Stop letting these banks get away with pretending that these changes are still branches. But Martin, you and I, are we surprised that APRA, the regulator, has been so lax on the banks in this area? Right, everything else we've dealt with APRA, it's not surprising at all. The banks have captured the regulator; they run the show. This is a sort of a specialised area that Dale has exposed, but it's just one of a number of examples of how the banks run APRA. It's not the other way around.
Well, it's absolutely consistent, but I also make another point, Robbie, that if you talk to small businesses that actually do have to use cash through the banking system, they're also being charged a lot more than they were. So there's another barrier being thrown up, right? So if you can find somewhere to stow cash, you've also got to pay more to do it as well. So this whole thing is anti-cash. And, you know, whether you look at APRA, whether you look at the banks, the economics, households and businesses are being disadvantaged by this. And it's no good saying, well, everybody's digital, right? Because we know that particularly in regional areas, but not only in regional areas, digital doesn't cut the mustard.
Cut it. You cannot rely on digital in regional Australia. You just cannot. And so it seems to me the way the banks work is they push people down a certain path, right? Go in this direction. And of course, young people are prepared to take it up, wave their phones around. I was at a theme park yesterday and all these people were paying by waving their phones around. But I tell you what, the theme park had plenty of cash because plenty of people were paying cash as well. So, but the banks are looking for a critical mass. And once they get to that critical mass, it's like they then say, oh, well, that percentage that aren't going to go in that direction, they don't count. We're just going to cut off their normal way of doing business because we've now got critical mass to do it in this digital way. And for Australia, that means most of regional Australia. This is crazy, which is not just people don't live in the bush. There's not just the sea change mentality that you go live in the bush. We have a lot of industry out there. A huge chunk of our economy is in regional Australia. Why aren't we servicing it? Right? Why are we letting the banks get away with this?
I have been told, and I won't name the bank, but when some of these alternative branch service models were rolled out years ago, any town whose digital, so their internet wasn't strong enough, they just lost their branch. They were rolled off the list. They weren't part of the critical mass. They were just dropped off. So that's pretty damning.
And I guess there's another point to make here is, of course, as we saw on the South Coast through the bushfires 2 or 3 years ago, the digital thing completely collapses when the power goes away for a few days. And if you don't have cash, you're completely stuck. So that's another issue that people haven't fully understood, that cash is still there and it's critical because it's a cornerstone of the economy right the way through. And you don't need power to use it.
No, that's right.
I pick up that in my main story, pick up on that. It's that the bushfire crisis really did highlight where the weakness in this whole thinking is.
Right. So we've got the petition, right, and we'll put the links below. This is to get effectively a formal inquiry into this issue. I guess, Robbie, the question then is, to what extent is the Australia Post Bank a solution to this problem? Is it the best solution? And how do those two issues then segue?
Well, it is a solution. It is not the only solution, because there is, and I think, Dale would agree, and I've spoken to politicians like this, these banks are a special breed of business, especially the big four. Everybody knows they enjoy an implicit government guarantee. And most reasonable people want to know why that doesn't come with a some form of social obligation on their part to maintain a service, given the implicit government guarantee they provide. So what Dale is calling for in this petition is a moratorium on them just shutting their branches full stop, because it's time the government grew a pair, can I say, and actually demanded the banks have some kind of a social obligation here. But the politicians have been completely impotent on this question. So this is something pushing the point on that, which we should do anyway. What we propose with the postal bank solution is, in this regard, is a mechanism that can also help, because it provides a competitive pressure on the banks. And I think, Dale, it was you who pointed out to me in one of our conversations a while ago that the 1982 Campbell report, which talked about privatising the banks, especially the Commonwealth Bank, predicted that when the Commonwealth Bank was privatised, the banks would shut a heap of branches. And doesn't that prove that that kind of competition from a government bank is actually very good for the banks in this regard? It's what can force them to keep their branches open.
Yeah. No, there's a lot to be learnt from history, and going back and reading those reports is very, very enlightening, just to see how things have panned out. But I can't remember exactly which report it was. I've read them all back to 1985. But when there was an awful lot of discussion very early on and lobbying from the major banks, that I think whining is a good word to describe this, complaining about it not being fair, that the government banks had a slightly competitive advantage over them because they weren't ripping their customers off and they were providing a service. So I hate to say this, I'm not political, but it has been the Liberal coalition governments just watered down, they watered down the powers of the government, the Commonwealth Bank at the time, to a point where it was a reasonably level playing field. But that was all because of the banks complaining.
So what the postal bank would do is be again a new government bank operating in the cheapest form possible way through the existing post offices. It would require a certain amount of investment to bring those post offices up to speed so they can handle cash properly. And in fact, this is one of the things that Christine Holgate was trying to do with her banking deal anyway, because the cash handling part is the essence of banking. She understood that, and she asked the banks to fund Bank at Post more so they could roll out the infrastructure to handle cash, including the security side of it. So if you have a dedicated government bank, though, operating through post offices the way the Commonwealth Bank started back 110 years ago, it can provide the infrastructure for that. And then then the ball's in the private bank's court. Do they want to lose all their regional customers to a bank that is going to guarantee its service first and foremost and never shut down? And further to your point about these existing 1,018 branches, how they're kind of clustered around larger centres in regional Australia, look at a picture of the footprint of Australia Post post offices across Australia. It has the best distributed retail footprint in the country, right? It is a great service to be able to house this. So, Martin, we had a postal bank forum in the federal parliament on the 7th of September. Dale attended that as our guest so that she could share her expertise in this area. And that forum was excellent. We had 4 politicians come and demonstrate their support for the policy of a postal bank. We had a former cabinet minister from New Zealand there, Matt Robson, who told the story of Kiwi Bank. And you've interviewed Matt on your show. But one of the points that Matt made in this that's relevant to this is that just like in Australia, in New Zealand in the 90s, the private banks were shutting down branches everywhere. As soon as Kiwi Bank started in 2002, the private banks announced a moratorium on bank branch closures. Now, why would they do that? Right? Because that's what competition does. And real competition at a service level. A friend of mine has pointed out that the only competition that our banks have is competition to who can make the biggest profit. That's not how competition is supposed to work. The competitive pressure is supposed to be a break on profits to a degree because you're trying to get the best service for your customer. That's not what happens in the banking system now. Yet the Kiwi Bank is an example of if you have a government bank, the private banks realise we better compete with that. We better stop shutting branches. And that was one of the excellent points that Matt Robson made at this forum. You were there as a guest, Dale. I was just sort of exhausted from having worked so hard to pull the thing off and make sure it happened. What was your impressions from being in the audience of the forum?
Oh, look, it was nice to see that it's reached political level. That for me, look, I'm a journalist. I am impartial. I haven't commented on the government bank proposal because I don't think it's my role. Personally, I think it is quite a good answer to, if the banks are going, something's got to happen. So for me, it was seeing that there's mechanisms happening at the political level because it's really, as a journalist, it's you write and you just put it out there and you hope that something will change. But it's until it gets to that level that you can't achieve anything. So that was my main impression. Just very pleased to see politicians talking about it.
And I can tell you now the politicians who attended and spoke at the forum included people like Bob Catter, Senator Malcolm Roberts, and Senator Gerard Rennick. They're really committed to public bank general and the potential for that you can have if we go back to having a government banking entity in Australia, both for service but for economic development, etc. But I know we had a bunch of meetings, Martin, before and after the forum with members of parliament, including with 2 cabinet ministers. And I can tell you now, the number one issue that's driving the political interest in this is the wave of bank branch closures. That's what's got everyone's attention. That's what's got everyone alarmed. Every politician who met with us is driving them nuts. And how's this? That fact alone tells you the banks are lying, because the banks would like us to believe that they're shutting their branches because there's no demand, right? Well, why is there such an outcry across Australia every time they do it? Because there is a demand. They're just trying to lie. They're trying to gaslight us and expect us to swallow it. Well, I've lobbied politicians on many, many issues. I've seen nothing like this response we're getting from them on this issue because they're all getting the feedback on this question. And that's why I think from the standpoint of our policy solution of the postal bank, this is one we can win. But it is being driven by this question. And when we can connect it to the cash question, right, that, understand that there's a you can defeat a bad policy politically, like the cash ban as we did. But under the way our economy works, these four big banks have so much power that they are forcing cash use out of the economy. They're forcing us to a cashless economy, which will have enormous consequences. Then people get just as fired up about that, and that's why I think we're on to a winner here. But that is something that just take it from me. If I'm getting this response from politicians, it's because it's a huge issue and the banks are lying to you.
And I'll make one point, Robbie, that you mentioned about the competitive dynamics within banking. Well, there's one that people need to understand, and that is the last bank standing has the biggest problem, right? So what you don't want to be is that very last branch in town, because you're going to get the biggest amount of publicity. So what tends to happen is that they all run for the exit, and the slowest is the one that gets left with the biggest problem.
Yeah.
That is exactly what I'm seeing, Martin. I'm seeing things that I've never seen before, and that's a town losing two banks within 3 months of each other. So they announce they're going at the last, they think they're the second last bank, but then it's a bit of a race to see who can get out first. But I think there's an important point that needs to be made. So just looking at the figures. So in just going back to the start of 2021, Regional Australia, and that's my focus, has lost 218 banks across the state. 2021, I think it was 117 across Regional Australia. This year we're up to 63. Just in those 117, there were a huge amount of towns that lost two banks and something like 40 that lost their last banking services. So NAB is the worst offender for doing that. But just getting into this year, 63 banks have closed this year. It's a slightly lower number. I think it's definitely going to go up by the end of the year. But while I don't report them, I do see the Metro bank closures come through as well. And what has been happening, like Regional Australia is running out of banks that the banks can close. So they have, in the last few years, they've started on the suburban banks. And this is, I've seen an awful lot of suburban banks go this year as well. So, the complete numbers, which I don't think anyone tracks properly, including APRA, are much, much higher. So it's an issue for people who are living in cities as well. And a banking inquiry, while I'm asking for a regional inquiry, it will open the box and it will fix, hopefully, a lot of issues that are affecting suburban customers as well.
Yeah, and that's very important, I think, because this is, as you say, started in regional areas, but it's nibbling around the suburban areas. And in fact, again, in my surveys of small businesses are having to travel a lot further, even in those sort of outer suburban areas, to be able to get the banking service that they need. And if you try and actually find a business banking hub, they're like hen's teeth now, whereas actually you could do a lot of business banking in a lot of different outlets. So it's also the quality of the outlets that are left and what the range of services are that they're providing. They're just nibbling away left, right and centre, becoming effectively less and less able to service the needs of both businesses and consumers. And unfortunately, they have a lot of power, the banks. But hopefully, Robbie, the politicians now are beginning to wake up to the fact that this is a big issue. And I guess the question I've got is, are they really going to do anything, or will they just mess around like they've been messing around the last 5 years?
Oh, left to their own devices, they're going to mess around, but that's why we're not leaving them to their own devices. That's the thing. Like you and I have talked about this many, many times. You can get cynical about politics because it deserves cynicism, but there's a certain amount of it that when people become disengaged, and that makes the problem worse, right? So it's always better to be engaged. And I really take my hat off to Dale, because she's done this. She became obsessive about this, but thank God somebody did, because one woman has done the job of a whole bank regulator, which is what required by law to do it, and hasn't done it. But that has what we now have accurate figures for a problem. That's not a problem. You can't say this is a problem nobody knew about. everybody affected has known about it, right? Everybody inconvenienced right across Australia has known about how bad this problem is. We're seeing a lot of heat from Western Australia, where we put it down to the fact that in those towns in the wheat belt in Western Australia, unlike, say, Victoria, where you might have to drive half an hour to the next town, in the wheat belt in Western Australia, you might have to drive an hour and a half to the next town because it's so more spread out, etc. And people are screaming over there about this issue, but it's affected the whole country. And so everybody knows it's a problem. Dale's done the work to quantify the problem. The politicians now have the two to deal with, but what we've got to do is make sure the public heat comes in on them, and you do that in stages. So this petition is an excellent vehicle for that. We really need to maximise the signatures in the next 10 days. Now, we don't have to break any kind of record because Jim Chalmers has to respond to it anyway. It's just the more signatures there, the more he'll look at the fact that these signatures have been accumulated in a pretty short period of time, because it's a rather short turnaround, this petition, unfortunately. It's got a limit on it.
With a week less, they didn't let me know it was live. The email didn't come through.
That's Parliament for you.
21 days we've had to do this. Can I just mention, Robbie, exactly what you've said. The reason this petition is so powerful is that it's a direct voice to Parliament. There's been other petitions. There's one online still, I think, that was a change.com, and it wasn't focused on regional. It was just stop bank closures. And so I think it was more of a suburban focus. That's been going for 6 months, and it's got about 28,000 signatures on it. I've been going for 21 days. We've got over 2,000, which I think is a great. Every time I look at it, it's going up. It's going up.
Yep.
We got some great publicity from the ABC on the weekend, and but with the difference between the change petition and this one is this is in the parliamentary system. It has to be responded to, and it will work in conjunction with exactly what Robbie's been saying about the politicians are being hammered at the moment about banks being closed, and they're starting to notice. So it's going to be one of the things that is coming at the Treasurer that he needs to pay attention to. I've been giving them a very hard time through my writing, other stories. I've hammered them on the ARPA database. They're getting a shake-up in Senate estimates, all of that sort of thing. It all adds up to this being the time. It's been 17 years since they looked at this properly. The very last word politically on this in Hansard and in an official report is the Labor government saying that if the banks couldn't behave properly, I'm paraphrasing a little bit, but if they couldn't stop closing regional branches, they would look at, the Liberal government even said this, they would look at community service obligations, but the Labor government went as far as to say that they would re-regulate the banks if they didn't stop closing branches. And they're in government. Yep. And we need to hold them to that. It's there in front of them. Penny Wong signed it. So she's still a sitting member.
Both Penny Wong, who was on the last one 17 years ago, and then the previous one, one of the members of that inquiry was our current Prime Minister, Anthony Albanese. So arguably two of the foremost senior politicians in this government have sat on these inquiries, understand the problem, should be absolutely shocked being forced to look at it again all this time later and realise, well, the banks didn't improve. So now it's time for them to put their money where their mouth is and say, okay, we said we'd re-regulate. What are we going to do? And that's what an inquiry can do. So I can't emphasize enough. You really got to help us share this petition in the next 10 days and maximize the signatures. Now, if we get an inquiry, that's when lots of different things can be looked at in relation to this question. One thing I would like looked at is just how unprofitable are these bank branches that they're shutting? Because I'm strongly of the opinion that's rubbish. They're not unprofitable at all. And I'll give you an example of that. Dale, yesterday you were on Australia All Over on ABC with Macca, one of the biggest ABC shows. and Dale got to talk about this petition. But then someone called in a little while later to talk about how when they had a similar problem, they started the community bank. And then this gentleman was boasting, rightfully so, how successful their community bank has been. Now, a community bank is a bank where the locals put up all the money to run the branch, and it runs under license to Bendigo Bank or one of those. So your deposits go to Bendigo, or the bank that it's the community bank for. But there's a flow of money in and out of the branch, and the expenses come out of that flow of money. He said they've put $3 million from their community bank back into the community over the life of the community bank, and they pay dividends to the local investors who put up the money. Well, that's not unprofitable. If a community bank can be profitable like that, don't tell me one of the big four bank branches can't be profitable. I don't think it's because they're unprofitable. I think they're not profitable enough in this maximum profit drive that the private banks are on. All these things should be looked at by an inquiry. Force the banks to actually tell the truth about these matters. And the other thing that it can look at is, because if we get an inquiry, we would encourage people to make submissions to push the solution side, which would include the extra competition from a government bank, i.e. the postal bank. But that's an inquiry can open up the books on all this. And with a new government, and the other thing, post-Royal Commission. So the last two inquiries were pre-Royal Commission. The 2018 Banking Royal Commission has to be a sea change in the way Australia looks at this. Now, unfortunately, we had a Liberal government, and under Morrison and Frydenberg, they were determined to make sure that Royal Commission never went anywhere, and they got to use COVID as cover to stop it from going very far at all. So, but that's their ploy. The public saw what happened in that Royal Commission. The public saw the truth come out about banking. So if we can get an inquiry into this subject post-Royal Commission, where people have a much better understanding of what the banks are capable of, I think it can have more impact as well.
And I'll tell you one thing, Robbie, that one of the reasons why they claim unprofitability is all to do with the allocations processes, because you can shift cash and other costs all over the place inside these big balance sheets on the big banks, and you can make whichever bits of the banks you want more profitable rather than less profitable. I know I spent many years working in the financial sector of a big bank, and I understand precisely how the allocations work. You can set the policy up the way you want to make it work, and if you don't want to make branches profitable, then you can make them unprofitable, but that doesn't mean they're not really profitable. It's just hiding some of the truth and shifting some of the costs.
The other thing that happens in regional branches, Martin, is that the business accounts and the farming accounts are moved. Without permission, they have been moved to bigger central hub branches. So they're not on the books of these smaller branches. So that would have a significant impact if those those accounts were counted in the branches. I'm quite fascinated by this viability thing. Robbie mentioned that Anthony Albanese was on one of the first regional banking inquiry, and that inquiry and that panel, that board, actually brought in what is known as the branch closure protocol, and this is surrounded in legislation. I'm not sure if it's legislated, but it's definitely a legally enforceable document. And in the original version, it stated that banks would have to prove that they're not viable before leaving, being the last bank, and provide alternative services and that sort of thing. It was about the only toothy thing to come out of that inquiry, and it would have been that committee with Albanese on it were genuinely concerned about the welfare of regional communities. And when that final report was presented to the government and they published their response, it was the Howard government, agreed with the recommendation, but they watered it down by adding two words, which were "if viable." And the Australian Banking Association ran with that, and they have that document it's got more legal holes now. I don't know how. I'd love to see someone try and test it I don't know if they'd go very far because the banking associations made sure it's so airy that it would be hard to enforce. But I think banks should be challenged on whether those branches are viable or not. And I think they need to look at those bigger accounts that have been moved to other centres.
No, it's a very important point, and it goes back to the economics of the banking system can be made to look one way or the other way, right, depending on what you want to do. So it's not like it's objectively independent, 100% right. There are so many different things that could go wrong. Look, I think we've covered the ground pretty well, but just to re-emphasise, that petition, it's there, it's ready for another week or so. Go make your views known to Parliament through this petition. It's really, really important, and all power to your elbow with regard to the regional, and we'll put the link to the regional as well. It's a very important read. And Robbie, thanks to you also for bringing the post bank to the party as well, because I think this is also part of the story.
Thanks, Martin. We'll keep pushing on, and I take my hat off to Dale for the work she's done. This is how you change history, doing that kind of work. People with passion, doing it off their own bat. She's done a great job, and now we can use that information for the good of the country. So thanks, Dale, and thanks for giving us the publicity, Martin.
No, very glad to do that. And Dale, just again, thanks to you for all your work. It is amazing what you've done, given the resources you had, and the message that you've been able to really develop is really, really powerful. And again, I recommend that people go look.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you very much, both. We'll see you on the next one. This is Martin North from Digital Finance Analytics.